Welcome, everyone. We're pleased that you could join us for the Invasive Species Council of Metro Vancouver's 2022 Fall Forum. As a nonprofit society, we also hold an annual general meeting once a year, so we're also covering that today. My name is Tasha Murray. I'm the Executive Director with the ISCMV. I am at our office in Vancouver, and we also have our operations coordinator, Larissa Lau, helping to host this meeting from her home office. We would like to thank the Coast Salish nations of Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish, on whose traditional territory we live and are working today. Please take a moment to consider how you can do a territory acknowledgement wherever you are signing in from today. We have over 70 people registered for today. And from really all over the province, mostly focused on Metro Vancouver, but we have some friends and colleagues from further afar as well. So for any technical questions, you can message Larissa or I privately. And because we are expecting a large number today, we ask that you keep yourselves muted. And as a way to introduce yourself, you could rename yourself with your name and your affiliation, like I've done in my little thumbnail. And throughout the event, if you have questions for us or for our presenters, you can pop those into the chat. Here is the agenda for today. So we've got a couple of great presentations that are sandwiching our really short business annual general meeting and will be wrapped up well before 3 o'clock. The meeting is being recorded and the presenters are kindly making their slides available afterwards. And within a week, everyone registered for the event will receive a follow-up message from me with details how to access those documents. So the recording, the slide decks, and any other links that we share during today's meeting. And if you have any specific questions, you can always contact me afterwards too, but don't feel like you need to madly take notes during today. So we'll be referencing a number of documents during the meeting, which are all available on our website. Larissa's going to pop that link into the chat right now. So the agenda includes information on sort of abstracts for our presenters and also bios for all of our presenters. And during the AGM portion, we have a few business items to cover. And so many of those documents that we'll be covering are also available on the website. So during the AGM, we'll be inviting our members to vote on some of those documents. Membership is free and the membership year starts today at our AGM and it's open to anybody. And so by participating in voting, you confirm your membership with the ISCMV. If you don't want to vote, that's totally fine too. You can just simply abstain when you see the polls pop up on your screen just during the AGM portion. So before we get started, I wanted to kind of introduce what the ISCMV is, if this is your first event that you've attended with us. So we're a not-for-profit society, one of the regional invasive species committees, and we were established in 2006, and our mission is to improve invasive species management in the Metro Vancouver region. So I think my job is really to help all of you do your jobs better. And some of the ways we do that, connecting people to resources, answering questions from practitioners, but also from the public. We host regional invasive species events, develop resources. We do a lot of training of staff and volunteers who work on invasives within the region. We also coordinate a number of stewardship projects, and we do small projects and consulting, and also have a really small seasonal field crew. So after today, if you liked what you heard, we'd love to connect with you afterwards. We have a mailing listserv where we send information about events like this that are happening in Metro Vancouver. And you can find information on our website about how to get on that list. I'm going to stop sharing my screen as it's time for our first presenters. So I have some bios that I'll read, but you guys can feel free to get your presentation loaded up. So I'm not going to read their entire bios. That's one of the documents you can find on our website if you want to read in more details. But we have a couple of staff from ESA Technologies who are going to tell us about a report they did on invasive species impacts on species at risk. Natasha Tamburello works at the intersection of marine and freshwater ecology, natural resource management, and science communications, and has applied her skills across a wide range of projects in fisheries, ecological restoration, and invasive species management in North America and abroad. She completed her doctoral work studying the spatial ecology of marine invasive species in the Caribbean to inform effective management strategies, and has continued her work in the invasive species space through a series of projects involving policy analysis, risk assessment, and strategic planning. When not at her desk in Vancouver, she savors opportunities to spend time visiting and getting to know the people, places, and ecosystems that intersect with her work. Aileen Litt is an environmental researcher with experience working with the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. Between 2019 and 2022, she worked as a research assistant with ESA Technologies, where she provided research and analytical support for a range of environmental projects on topics including cumulative effects, species at risk, and invasive species. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Memorial University in Newfoundland and a Master's of Science in Biology from Carleton University. From her diverse work experience, Aileen has garnered skills in quantitative and qualitative analysis and has learned to integrate both social and ecological methodologies to address her research questions. When not at work, she enjoys hiking, camping, gardening, and cooking. And we're really excited to welcome you both to tell us a bit more about your research.
Thank you so much for those introductions, Tasha. I will just get this screen shared with you all, and then we can get started. All right, are you seeing that?
Looks great, thanks.
Great, thank you. So I guess I can skip my own introduction now, other than to say, yeah, I'm Natasha Tamburello. I'm an ecologist at, as Tasha said, a small environmental consulting company, ESA Technologies, based here in Vancouver. And so, like many of you, I'm also privileged to be speaking to you from the territories of the Coast Salish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations. And as we heard, I'm joined here today by my colleague, Aileen Litt, who collaborated with me on this work. We're going to be speaking to you today about some work we carried out for the Invasive Species Council of BC on a systematic review of the impacts of invasive species, like this red-eared slider here up front and center, on species at risk in the province, like these painted turtles sitting alongside it. And thanks for having us at your meeting in AGM. So I'll go ahead and get us started. British Columbia is a biologically diverse province with a high species richness relative to its latitude when looking at both terrestrial and marine species. But as I'm sure many of you are well aware, over 1,600 of BC species are provincially assessed as being at risk of being lost or of special concern, and 200 of them are listed under the Federal Species at Risk Act. Now, what are they at risk from? Canada-wide reviews have shown that most of these species are known to be at risk from multiple threats, including invasive species, and that these threats, including invasive species, again, are increasing over time. So as of 2018, roughly half of all species at risk in Canada and in BC are at risk from introduced species and invasive species, up from 20% in 2005. But many questions remain about the nature of these threats. And the study that we worked on for the ISCBC sought to answer some questions and increase understanding about which invasive species are impacting species at risk, where those impacts are happening, how they're happening, and to what degree they are happening. And the intent was to help meet the goals of the Invasive Species Council of BC's research objectives, research roadmap for invasive species research in the province. With the ultimate intent, hopefully being to use the results of this study to inform more targeted prevention activities sponsored by the ISCBC and management activities, as well as, in particular, outreach activities to different user groups that have a role in spreading invasive species. Now, these kinds of systematic assessments of invasive species impacts are often hindered by a lack of information. Sometimes this is because of true data gaps. And often it's also the case of really fragmented documentation of existing data across numerous sources. And so this study, I would say, set out to tackle this latter problem by making a big push towards the consolidation of information about these impacts across many single species status assessments and recovery plans to help reveal some bigger picture patterns. You know, starting down this road means there could have been hundreds of species at risk to investigate, and we had a relatively small timeline and budget for this work. So we needed to find ways to streamline the process. And we were really fortunate to be able to leverage raw data from 2 previous national studies screening for impacts to invasive species. Those are these 2 by McCune and Woodurand below. They both took the approach of screening all species at risk across Canada for the different kinds of threats that were flagged in their species at risk documentation. And so we looked at those data sets, which were kindly shared with us, and started by picking out all of those species at risk within these data sets that had invasive species flagged as a threat. That gave us 163 species at risk to start with. And then given the management focus of this work, we further narrowed down the list by screening further against BC's priority invasive species list, which includes species that are considered to have the highest risk and management potential. And that intersection, you know, that list includes 182 invasive species, and combining those together, those 2 screenings brought us down to 92, a bit more of a manageable number of species at risk for our detailed assessment. So that assessment, that deep dive that we took into each species at risk was carried out through a systematic literature review. We relied heavily and started from SARA recovery plans and CASIWIC assessment reports, but we also did additional literature review to fill in gaps for specific kinds of information, such as mechanism of impact or specific areas of concern. We extracted and logged the details for each invasive species at risk pair mentioned in these reports. Often one species at risk had multiple invasive species listed as being a threat. And we logged these details, which include things like are listed here in the bullets, characteristics of the species at risk and invasive species, a narrative summary of impact as stated in species at risk documentation, whether there are any geographic regions of particular threat, mechanisms of threat, vectors of spread, etc. And these were all logged in a sortable, filterable tracking spreadsheet, which I do want to flag as being really a useful product in its own right for those who are interested in honing in on one or just a few invasive species to get that more detailed information. And the intent was to use this detailed assessment to start answering some of these questions about which, where, how, and how much invasive species are impacting species at risk in the province. So I'm going to take you now through a few of the initial key results from this work before handing it over to Aline to complete the results section and talk a bit about some of the case studies where we focused in on some of the stories that emerged from our work to give that a bit more of local context and problem-specific context. So the main event, the main result of our work, as I'm sure you're not surprised to hear, is that a small number of invasive species are really having impacts on a disproportionate number of species at risk. For the most part, these top most offending invasive species are plants, including Scotch broom, a variety of grasses, Himalayan blackberry, and some others. You'll also notice a few fish on this list. These are mostly sport fish that were introduced for recreational purposes into local freshwater waterways and lakes. And there are also a few other taxa on there, American bullfrog and domestic and feral cats rounding out the other taxa. If we look now on the flip side at which species at risk are the most impacted by invasive species, we see again that some are disproportionately impacted and that the vast majority of these are plants. The next most common species at risk impacted are arthropods. It's sort of that mustard color. And we also see some representation of reptiles, our painted turtle from the cover slide, and fish, bull trout. The color coding on this figure on the names of the species at risk are matched to the taxonomic groups of the species, invasive species that are impacting them on the stacked bars. And so you'll see that in most cases, they match up. So plants tend to be most impacted by plants and so on. There are a few examples here where some arthropods are impacted by invasive arthropods, but also by invasive plants. This is especially the case where there are relationships between arthropods and plants, for example, where a plant is impacting the native host plant of an arthropod of concern. And now to help to visualize the bigger picture of the multi-species interactions, of which those bar graphs were only showing us a small slice, we also wanted to portray this information on all of the invasive species and species at risk pairs as a network diagram. And here it is. I want to stress up front that this is a partial network in that only direct invasive species and species at risk connections are represented, as that's what was documented in the literature we looked at. And of course, there will also be interactions between invasive species with each other, between species at risk with each other, and between both with other native species that are also going to be very important, but are not really well documented in the species at risk literature itself. So looking at that more community perspective is still a gap in this picture. This diagram helps us see some interesting patterns and trends. So we can see here some clearly emerging clusters of invasive species and species at risk impact in different ecological communities. At the top, we see a cluster for vertebrates, birds, mammals, and a few reptiles in there that tend to be interacting with each other. There's another large cluster in the middle where all of the plants live, as well as some of the arthropods and mollusks that depend on them. And then we have another clear cluster at the bottom of aquatic and amphibious species interacting with each other. Also interesting to note those linkages that cross these communities where species are mediating impacts, across different communities or ecosystems. Also on this figure, we can see represented visually those species that are impacting the most species at risk, or the species at risk that are the most impacted in terms of number of linkages. So those are the very large circles are the species at risk impacted by the greatest number of invasive species, and the biggest squares are the invasive species impacting the most number of species at risk. And then we can also see represented here the invasive species with the highest degrees of impact in terms of severity, pervasiveness, magnitude, which Aline will speak to later. And that's represented by the thickness of the line. So the thicker the line, the more severe the impacts along that interaction. And yeah, I think that this is another way to just help us remember that all of these species are interacting in the context of their broader communities, and really stresses the need for these increasing calls we're seeing for multi-species, community, and ecosystem-based approaches to invasive species management and species at risk management, which we'll come back to later. The letters you see on this network diagram are picking out the most impactful and the most impacting species by taxonomic group, whereas the previous figures were by sheer numbers of impacts only. And we can zoom in on those a little bit here to see who they are. So these are the most impactful invasive species and the most impacted species at risk in their respective taxonomic groups. I want to just make clear that in most cases, there's not a direct linkage between these two within the same taxonomic group, but in some cases there is, as in the case here with the reptiles, we see red-eared slider alongside painted turtle again. So a nice way to visualize the scale, the network of the interactions, and then think about who these species are to help inform our management planning. And this is where I'm going to hand it over to Aline to speak to a few more of the results and then dive into some case studies. Aline, just let me know when you want me to flip over the slide.
Thanks, Natasha. Okay. I'm ready to go to the next slide now. In addition to looking at which invasive species were most impactful and which species at risk were most impacted, we also asked where these impacts were occurring. And so to do this, we started with the eco-provinces of BC as a unit of analysis, and then we determined the location of species at risk within those eco-provinces. And so if we go to the next slide, you can see this chloropleth map that shows the highest concentration of impacts in red, going down to white for the eco-provinces where we don't have documented interactions between invasive species and species at risk. And as you can see, the most impacts are occurring along the coast and in the southern portion of BC, particularly in the Georgia Depression. And this roughly follows the concentration of human activities in the province, which isn't overly surprising when you think about all the connections between invasive species and human development and human activities. Could you go to the next slide? So looking at the same information, but broken down by habitat, so terrestrial, freshwater, and marine, we can see significant bias towards invasive species impacts in terrestrial habitats, followed by freshwater, and very little information in the marine environment, or very little documented impacts. But this may not be a true reflection of the state of things. There are a few reasons that this is happening with our data. One is that marine invasive species are not included on BC's priority list of invasive species. In addition, marine species at risk tend to be listed in Canada due to overexploitation, with fewer listings due to other threats. And lastly, these interactions are much harder to study than terrestrial interactions. It's harder to know what's going on there. So we may just not be aware of some of the invasive species impacts in the marine environment. Next slide. So another question we asked was, how are invasive species impacting species at risk? And this donut chart shows across all species at risk the mechanism of impact. And so these range from behavioral changes to the species at risk, biofouling, collateral damage from invasive species management, and through the list you can see on the screen there. The most common were predation, habitat alteration, and competition. And if we go to the next slide, we can see these mechanisms broken down into by the taxonomic group of the species at risk. Again, here within taxonomic groups, predation and habitat alteration tend to be the most common mechanisms of impact. Competition is most common for plants, fish, and mammals. And a few other things to note, genetic effects such as hybridization are primarily seen in reptiles, fish, and plants. Another example there would be interbreeding of turtles. And disease effects were primarily seen for amphibians, mammals, and reptiles. And then for the arthropods, you'll notice that one of the main mechanisms is collateral damage from invasive species management, which appears for amphibians and in a few other places, but is a bigger impact or mechanism, sorry, in arthropods. Next slide. If you look at mechanisms of impact across the habitats of species at risk, the results don't look all that varied, except in terms of the number of impacts recorded. That number in the middle of the donut plot refers to the number of impacts that are counted in that donut plot. So again, you'll see that the marine habitat, we have fewer documented cases. Next slide. Again, if you break down the same information by eco-province, the mechanisms of impact don't look all that varied, with the exception of perhaps the taiga plains where there's less variety. But again, this may just be a product of only having 4 documented interactions in that area. Next slide. Another question we asked was, how are the invasive species that are impacting species at risk being introduced? For this, we almost entirely relied on peer-reviewed papers and sources other than the species at risk documentation, which wasn't usually focused on where the invasive species came from. And we found that a high number of non-native species that were impacting species at risk were intentionally introduced. And they were introduced for a variety of reasons, including things like erosion control, forage for cattle and other animals, medicinal purposes, for consumption or recreation. So this category includes crops for food, as well as stocking fish for fishing, for example, and then ornamental varieties of plants for gardens and pest control, seed collection. And there were also some cases of accidental introduction through, for example, ballast water and so on as well. Next slide. Even though the majority of invasive species were found to be intentionally introduced, we actually found that they were spread for the most part unintentionally. And so this occurred through assistance with animals. So for example, burrs attaching to the fur of an animal, or attaching to human clothing, through contaminated soil, or through human development activities, bringing roads and vehicles to new areas, and so on and so forth. Exceptions to this unintentional spread included introduction of invasive species to new areas for pest control reasons, as well as unauthorized releases of fish being transferred from one water body to another. Next slide. So as Natasha mentioned earlier, we also looked at the magnitude of the threat of invasive species impacting species at risk. And we were able to do this because COSEWIC reports and recovery strategies usually include a threat calculator that assesses the magnitude of the threats faced by species at risk. And so we use these calculations to create figures showing the impact, scope, severity, and timing of the threat of invasive and problematic species. And we found, as you can see on the two right-hand plots, that the scope and the timing of the scope of these threats was pervasive, and the timing was high, meaning that it's current and continuing for the majority of focal species at risk in all taxonomic groups. The impact and severity ratings were more variable, but they also tend to be pushing the upper ends of their respective rating spectrums for most of the taxonomic groups. Next slide. We also asked what other threats are impacting the species at risk aside from invasive species. And to do this, we used data from those two previous slides that we used data from those two previous studies that we were building upon. And we calculated that species at risk impacted by invasive species are on average impacted by 3 other threat categories. And so you can see those other threat categories in the plot. And you can see that human intrusions or disturbances and development are the top additional threats that these species at risk face. These notable other threats weren't too surprising, in part because if you think back to that map that you saw earlier, the distribution of invasive species and species at risk pairs roughly aligns with the human population density in BC, and therefore may be reflective of the linkages between human activities contributing to invasive species and their distributions. Next slide. So in the report that we prepared for the Invasive Species Council of BC, we also included a set of case studies where we explored some recurring themes in our data in a more narrative way to just better highlight these case studies. And I'll just go through a few of them here. Next slide. Our first case study was BC's Most Wanted, which focused on the top invasive species that we already mentioned briefly earlier. As mentioned before, these species are mostly plants, which aligns with plants being the most common invasive species taxon in BC overall. And the top offender was Scotch broom, which is documented as a threat to 36 species at risk. Most of the species that at risk that it impacts are plants, but it also impacts an arthropod, mollusks, and birds. Scotch broom is also associated with other invasive species on the list of top 20 that we showed you earlier, including sweet vernal grass, soft brome, and orchard grass. The good news is that it is being managed at various sites in BC where species at risk are located. But the bad news is that it's quite challenging to combat because it thrives in disturbed areas, it's highly fecund, and the seeds that it produces are viable for up to 30 years. Next slide. Our next case study looked at the role of collateral damage from invasive species management. This was most commonly seen in control efforts directed at invasive insects and plants. For example, the European gypsy moth, whose caterpillar you can see on the slide. So control efforts for European gypsy moth threatens 6 different arthropod species at risk. And the immediate threat is a pesticide known as BTK, which has been used, applied in BC since the 1980s at various times to control European gypsy moth. And the less immediate risk is taconid flies, which were only introduced in the eastern United States and Canada, but could disperse westward on their own or through intentional introductions. I think I'm preaching to the choir when I say that prevention of invasive species is a much better approach than control after introduction. But if control is needed, it's crucial to consider the negative impacts on species at risk, for example, and other negative impacts before implementation. On to the next case study. So this case study looked at the localized invasions of native species. And so not all of the invasive species documented in this review originate from other countries or provinces even. We used a fairly non-restrictive definition of invasive species because there's a growing recognition that invasive species can be native species with changing or expanding distributions. So examples from our work include species on Haida Gwaii, such as the Sitka black-tailed deer, which were introduced in the late 1800s, early 1900s as a new game species, and common raccoon and red squirrels, which were introduced a bit later. And since the deer and the raccoon have been able to spread to new islands by swimming. Another example are Canada geese, which may be native to parts of BC, but were introduced to new areas for wildlife viewing and hunting opportunities. It's important to note that range shifts of native species will continue without any human assistance due to climate change moving forward. And it's not all native species with changing ranges should be considered invasive, but it's making the distinction will be challenging, and finding management approaches for both native and invasive species with changing ranges will be challenging moving forward and something to be aware of. Next slide. Another of our case studies was focused on sort of cautionary tales. So cases where invasive species had been implicated in extinctions or partial extinctions of species at risk. Unfortunately, there are a growing number of global extirpations and extinctions caused or at least partially attributed to invasive species. and BC is not free of these examples. So one group on our list, or two of our top species at risk, were the Paxton Lake and Venanda Creek stickleback pairs. And for these, it's important to keep in mind what happened to other stickleback pairs in BC. So the Hadley Lake stickleback pairs are now extinct as a result of unauthorized introduction of brown bullhead. And the Enos Lake stickleback pairs collapsed into one hybrid population, and that's attributed, at least in part, to the introduction of American signal crayfish. Other examples of local extirpation in BC, Macoun's meadowfoam and Victoria's owl clover, which are both on our list of top 20 species at risk, have experienced local extirpations that are attributed in part to invasive species. And bird colonies on Haida Gwaii have also experienced local extirpations. So these serve as cautionary tales of the potential fate of other species at risk if invasive species threats are not abated. Next slide. Our last case study looked at invasive species threats to species at risk that are important to Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples have used certain species at risk for cultural, nutritional, medicinal, spiritual, and material purposes for many generations, and have also served and continue to serve as stewards for many species at risk through their cultural land management practices like controlled burns to increase production of camas. The side benefit of controlled burns one of them was improving habitat suitability for many species at risk plants and for some birds and insects. The importance of species at risk to Indigenous people is not well documented in most Western science literature, partially due to the cultural sensitivity of making this information public. For example, this information is expunged from SARA documentation to respect intellectual and cultural property rights. And while we recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples to protect this information, we also acknowledge the importance of recognizing and considering species at risk, the value of species at risk to Indigenous groups as part of gaining a holistic understanding of their importance. We also think it's important to consider the cultural context of invasive species management on Indigenous lands. Indigenous peoples are often first respondents to invasive species threats and represent critical partners in control efforts. So looking at this invasive species management through a co-management lens will allow benefits from initiatives to extend far beyond just conservation of biodiversity to become culturally meaningful as well. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Natasha to talk about some key insights.
Thanks, Aline. So I'm going to bring our presentation to a close here with a few key insights and then highlighting some avenues for potential future work building on what we've done here. So in terms of key insights, really the main one is that invasive species have wide-ranging impacts on species at risk, and some are more problematic than others. Having this information collated and documented in one place, we believe can help managers to prioritize, for example, interventions that target the species at risk most vulnerable to invasive species impacts, like Macoun's meadowfoam, which Aline mentioned. On the other hand, invasive species interventions that can assist the widest range of species at risk. So for example, tackling Scotch broom in areas where there are a lot of species at risk, as is already being done in many places. But there are other aspects of management that this information can help to prioritize. So for example, most effective management interventions based on mechanisms of impact. We heard about, for example, collateral damage, and much could be gained from a closer look at that risk assessment when planning management for those invasive species, as well as targeting and prioritization for public outreach campaigns to focus on the most common vectors of introduction and spread of some of these major offending invasive species. And of course, our work in the fact that it included many gaps, provides a bit of a gap analysis in itself to help target and guide future research to fill these gaps and answer outstanding questions about the impacts invasive species are having on species at risk. And I also wanted to mention that the findings from this review can also help to inform and feed into more complex management and planning approaches, including things like priority threat management, which focuses on comparing cost effectiveness of alternative strategies to recover as many species as risk as possible per dollar invested, or structured decision making, which focuses on evaluating trade-offs for invasive species and species at risk management across multiple objectives, as well as informing more holistic management strategies that I mentioned before that are becoming increasingly in demand or called for, including threat-based management plans that would target a suite of invasive species altogether, or community or ecosystem-based recovery plans that would really look at both the invasive species and species at risk in a given community. There are some good papers here on the right for more information about those, or for examples of these approaches in practice. And then to close us out, I wanted to speak to potential future work. I've already mentioned filling gaps in this data set, which I think would be important. And one of those is looking deeper into some of the interactions between invasive species and between species at risk to look for information on things like synergies and symbioses and other things like that that are important. Among those interactions is some emerging evidence that in some cases, invasive species might actually benefit some species at risk while harming others. And so there are going to be trade-offs that need to be made for those. In some cases of those included arthropods at risk that have come to rely on invasive species as their new host plant when their native host plant is no longer available. It's going to be labor intensive, mostly focused on additional literature review, interviews, or targeted field research, but I do think this information will be valuable for managers. Other avenues for future work is this analysis would really lend itself to extension through a spatially explicit analysis that would help to prioritize limited management resources on those high-risk invasive species pairs where they co-occur in space and time, and could help to tailor regionally specific mechanisms of dispersal with interventions. This could also be really helpful for, as Aline mentioned at the end there, targeting interventions in areas of significance to Indigenous peoples. And there is ample information out there to begin this work through the BC CDC Conservation Data Center. And I know that Invasives BC and their invasive alien plant program is starting to assemble some of this similar spatially explicit data for invasive species occurrence as well that could be used together. Then, of course, there is the aspect of climate change that Aline mentioned earlier, and I think there is an urgent need for targeted research on the synergistic effects of both climate change and invasive species threats to our biodiversity and our species at risk. And there are many implications of climate-induced range shifts for both invasive species and species at risk that could be investigated further through habitat suitability modeling and validated through field surveys. And again, this could help to inform spatially targeted interventions, for example, assisted dispersal of species at risk outside of projected ranges of invasive species in the future under future climates. And then lastly, given the interest that we have received and continue to receive in this work, I really think there would be value in extending this kind of approach to a national scale. It would help to inform some of the national recovery planning work that's being done for species at risk, as well as more comprehensive national response strategy for invasive species. And as an example, it could be used to update guidance in the Federal Species at Risk Act through their critical habitat identification toolbox. And this is where the presentation ends for today, but I wanted to thank everyone for listening. I am going to, if I can find it, paste in the chat the link to the full report. I might have to wait till I stop sharing my screen to do that because I can't find my chat. And then I also just wanted to mention that we have peer-reviewed publication in the works based on this report that does include some of the more extended analyses we've done including that network diagram and analysis. And yeah, I'd love to hear any feedback from this group on additional insights or things you think we should mention in that paper. That would be greatly appreciated. Thank you all for listening, and we look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much. The report is actually available on our event webpage. So if you scroll to the top of your chat, which isn't too long at this point, the link that Larissa shared, you can find access to the report there, and that will stay on that page so folks can find it easily.
Perfect, thanks, Tasha.
A couple questions, and hope that maybe a few more might come in if you'd like to pop those into the chat. So we had one question just wanting confirmation that data from Vancouver Island was included. I think if you don't mind going back to one of the maps that showed Vancouver Island, it just was a little confusing whether that portion of BC was included in this work.
Oh yes, I think you're referring to the eco provinces. Yeah, it is a little confusing because it the boundaries cover both land and water. So you see here in the original eco province map, Vancouver Island is definitely included. It's just split into these two different eco provinces that include both terrestrial and aquatic area. So it's a little bit unintuitive, but yes, it was included.
Okay, great, thank you. And then also a question, I think it referred to the table on page 23, or sorry, slide 23, where would compassionate releases such as religious practices or in memory of someone, and also releases by schools, say teachers or students activities, releasing amphibians or something, fall under that?
Let me, 23. Just trying to find my slide numbers behind all the Zoom things. Oh, here we go. 2023. Oh no, it might have actually been this one or possibly this one. Introduction or spread. Yeah, Aline, maybe do you recall any information on things like that? I think you actually did see a few examples of that, didn't you?
No examples of those, like particular examples are coming to mind, but pets any releases of pets would fall under the ornamental bar on this graph. And then, yeah, so I think that's probably the closest aligned. And unauthorized releases on this bar graph would be where introduction of a species to a new area would fall. So I'm not sure if that fully answers. I didn't come across those specific examples to my recollection.
Yeah, I have read a little bit about this. There are some religious ceremonies that include things like release of fish into waterways, I think, at times. And yeah, in terms of memorial services, that, you know, planting of ornamental plants, for example, that could be another thing. But to our knowledge, it was not mentioned specifically in terms of impacts to species at risk. So it's possible that those impacts are occurring to native species, but not necessarily to species at risk that we looked at.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
I have a question. Where's the where are you going to be? Where's the chat? Like you said, this is going to be on the chat. You said you mentioned something about that.
Yeah, I think Larissa just reposted the link in the chat. I can see it there, so it should be right at the bottom there.
At the bottom.
If you don't see an option on your Zoom menu that says chat, there's probably a little button at the right-hand side that says more, and type on that, then there'll be an option where you can open up the chat window so you can see everything that people on the call might be typing in. Yeah. And the report will be available on the event website, so everyone will get a message from me in a few days with all of the links and documents that we're sharing at today's meeting.
So do you know will this web what is it, the website, will that do you know how to send that on to like I'm just wondering if you can send that on to my personal email, if you.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. If you want to, you can direct message me in the chat if you know how to do that, your email, and I'd be happy to send that link to you and the report to you. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, since we're talking about the report, I also wanted to mention that on the ICBC web link that Larissa posted in the chat, there will also be available, in addition to the report, that tracking spreadsheet that I mentioned, so folks can have a deeper dive into that and look at specific species and things like that as well. Thanks, Lucas.
Yeah, so there's
I got it.
Yes. Yeah.
Thanks, Lucas.
Hi, Grace, you want to ask your question?
Yes, you just mentioned something about specific species. So I was just wanting to clarify that. So if we have a particular species of an invasive, such as Himalayan blackberry, and we want to know what species at risk are most affected by that, is that information going to be like we could look at specific invasives and see what specific species at risk are affected? Is that going to be available?
Yes, so on the Invasive Species Council of BC website where the report is shared, there's also, it's either a direct link also on that website, or it is a link within the report itself to access this tracking spreadsheet in Excel. All of the rows are species at risk, and all of the invasive species are across the top as the columns, and you can see here in red where they intersect with each other. And you can also feel free to put your email in the chat, and I can also send that to you directly as well. But yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting that you asked, because someone reached out to me the other day, a graduate student who's using this data set to try to, I guess, assess the benefits of some of the invasive species control activities that are occurring in one part of BC. Where species at risk benefits would be one of them. So she's trying to use this to quantify some of the benefits of what they're doing.
It looks like Lori found.
Oh, perfect. There you go. Yes.
And I'll make sure that gets on the event website too, but a great question.
Great.
Do we have any final questions for Aileen and Natasha? All right, well, thank you both for joining us. And yeah, it's an important topic. I think folks like me have been talking about the impacts on species at risk by invaders, and it's really great to have this body of research now to kind of back up what we're saying and to get some of those details. So appreciate you both joining us today. Absolutely, thanks, Tasha. And when our paper hopefully eventually is published, I'll be sure to recirculate it back to you to share with the group. Yes. So that you can cite it. That would be great. Thank you. Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone. All right, well, we've come to that time in the meeting to do our AGM. And for those that might have joined a little bit late, just a reminder that I'll be providing a link and all of these resources that we're talking about from today's session in an email within a week. And also, rather than introduce yourself in the chat, if you feel like renaming yourself, as I have done with your full name and your affiliation, it's a great way to identify yourself. And you also have the opportunity to direct message anybody in the meeting if you want to make a personal connection that way. So I'm going to invite our chair, Melinda Yong, and a few other directors are going to be joining us and sort of tag teaming on the AGM portion, but Melinda is going to start us off.
Great, thank you, Tasha. Can everybody hear me? All right, so welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Thank you to Tasha and Larissa for organizing today's event, and of course, a special thank you to our great speakers, Natasha, Aileen, and later on, Emma. I've seen all of them speak before, and definitely their information is important and valuable to everybody that's working in the field of invasive species. So it's fantastic information for all of us to have in our work. So our first order of business is to approve last year's AGM minutes from 2021. When we last met online, and the AGM minutes were provided to everybody. So I'll ask everybody to vote on whether or not the minutes are approved or not.
Actually, so we're going to wait and do
Oh,
all
okay.
questions at once.
Okay, great.
We won't take a vote now, but hold that thought. And after Scott does his financial presentation, then we'll do the votes all at once.
Okay, great. So then I guess the next will be for Tasha to provide an overview of the year.
Sure. So by year in review, we're talking about 2021, 2022. So largely a lot of what I'll be focusing on is kind of last year's field season. First of all, I want to thank all of the folks. Many of you are represented here of the diverse partnerships that we have. So in 2021, we had 50 partners. Over half of those were funding partners, and too many people to name, but we're just so thrilled that we get to work with so many different folks and amazing organizations that are working on invasive species in Metro Vancouver. A little quick overview of our operational activities. So we're still sampling lakes in the region for invasive mussels, and our small operations program is still working to survey sites and treat some sites. And we also are pretty active working with different local governments on offering stewardship events, so largely invasive plant community weed pulls, but also planting events as well. These are some of our outreach and education stats from last year. Lots of workshops and presentations. And again, many of our partners are heavily involved in helping to host or to host us for those events. So that's really great. A few highlights. So of the suite of best management guides that we have for Metro Vancouver, 3 new were introduced in the last year. So poison hemlock, garlic mustard, and spurge laurel. And Larissa will pop into the chat the current website where you can access those BMPs. So these are technical guides for practitioners for all the information you might want to know about how to identify and track and manage and restore after dealing with many of these species. And this project is thanks to support from Metro Vancouver, and the City of Surrey was really instrumental in development of these particular BMPs, Diamond Head Consulting, and also the Regional Invasive Species Working Group. So a great partnership effort, and we're grateful to continue to build that suite of amazing resources that are used, by the way, not just within Metro Vancouver, but by colleagues around the province. A few other projects that were highlights for me. So the Trinity Western University, UBC, and Metro Vancouver climate modeling research was a really amazing project to be involved with that you're going to be hearing about very shortly from our next guest presenter. And I also wanted to mention that we were the recipient of a number of Stronger BC action teams over the last 2 field seasons. So as part of some COVID relief funding from the province, the Invasive Species Council of BC rolled out a number of action teams throughout the province. Last year, we had 2 teams, kind of a spring and fall winter team. And this year we had a team as well. So the photo on the bottom is actually from this year, from a Bell Slough yellow flag iris removal. So that's actually in the Chilliwack region, but we had a couple of teams emerging for that project. And I wanted to give a shout out to our 2022 action team members. A couple are on the call today, Brianna, Adrian, Riel, and Grace, and they're actually wrapping up their work this week. One of the stewardship projects we've been involved with for many, many years is the Glenbrook Ravine Restoration Project, largely directed by community volunteers and the New West Environmental Partner Society in partnership with us and the City of New Westminster. And last year we had a big party because we kind of hit a 5-year milestone of doing some amazing removal work and also planting of hundreds of plants over 5 years to get to a total of 1,357. So that was a really nice milestone to celebrate with an amazing and consistent group of volunteers that are out in Glenbrook Ravine in New Westminster. I cannot do a year in review update without sharing with you a few species that are really top of mind for me right now. And these 3 particular species I'm going to cover now are also high priority for the province to be tracking and monitoring. And so I encourage all of you, if you see any of these species, to let me know or to report them in the various ways that you might report in your own jurisdiction. So Tree of Heaven is shown here on the left. Just gonna get my laser pointer up. So these photos were actually taken by me in the Okanagan last week. I was on a field tour and saw lots of Tree of Heaven. We have some in our region, but there's lots in the Okanagan. So Tree of Heaven is a rapidly growing deciduous tree. It's native to China and it's become widespread across North America. It has a number of different common names, including stinking sumac and stink tree, because it does actually emit a foul smelling odor. And here are what the leaves look like up close, but it can be very large. And then a related invasive plant is the spotted lanternfly, which is an invasive plant hopper that's native to Southeastern Asia. And it's problematic and invasive in many other parts of the world. And the adult insects feed primarily on the Tree of Heaven, although the nymphs are known to attack a wide range of native hardwood and fruit trees. So we have concern about the Tree of Heaven as an invader, but we also have compounding concerns because of its potential host of the spotted lanternfly, which has not been yet found in Canada. So we're lacking some provincial and local resources on this species, but if you search for the common names Tree of Heaven or spotted lanternfly, and put Canada in there, there are a number of CFIA and Invasive Species Center resources that will pop up. And in a case of pop culture merging with all of the work we do, Saturday Night Live actually had a little skit on the spotted lanternfly last Saturday. So if you want to check that out, it's just over 3 minutes long. Larissa will pop that link into the chat. That's what this image is here. It is somebody dressed in an amazing spotted lanternfly costume, and you can learn a little bit more about what the lanternfly is doing in the States if you check out that video after we adjourn for today. A couple other species that are on my radar. So great leopard's bane or leopard's bane, shown on the left here, is a perennial herb from Stolons. The basal leaves are heart-shaped with long stalks. The flower heads have ray and disc flowers that are both yellow, and this is a plant that's been introduced through horticulture, so it could be potentially purchased or seeds planted intentionally. And then finally, common fennel, which is an edible plant. You might be familiar with it as a herb or a vegetable even. And it looks just as you would imagine it would. It's got thin, feathery leaves and yellow flowers, and it's a member of the carrot plant family, which we're familiar with because we have so many invasive plants that come from that plant family. So those are just a quick snapshot of some of the species that I'm thinking about and trying to track in the region, and it would be great if you could become familiar with those species as well. And I think now I'll pass it back to Melinda for the next item on our agenda.
Great, thank you, Tasha. So our next agenda item will be the financial slide. And so I'll introduce our treasurer, Scott Walmsley.
Hi, everybody. At the AGM, we asked the membership to approve the financial statements from the previous fiscal year, as well as approve the budget for the current year. The statements we're presenting are available on the website for you to view. Tasha will provide a few highlights from the last fiscal year.
Sure. So the year-end statements for just the last fiscal year show a surplus of just over $11,000, which is due to funding being received in the previous fiscal year, but earmarked for that fiscal year. So our year end is March 31st. So it's often the case that we receive funds offset from our fiscal year when we're actually doing the work. Our spending in the last fiscal year was slightly lower than the previous year, but it's budgeted to be very similar for this upcoming year. Does anyone have any questions for Scott or I about the financial statements or about the proposed budget for the current fiscal year? We're open to answering questions at any other time. So if you do take a little dive later into those documents and you want to clarify anything, please get in touch with us.
All right, are we doing the voting now?
So you're going to see the 3 questions pop up at once, asking you to approve the previous AGM minutes and then approving the financial statements that Scott just mentioned, as well as the current fiscal year budget. So you'll see a pop-up screen that you can vote on there, and I'll give everybody a minute to do that. Okay, it looks like the voting is slowing down, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll now, and thank everybody. It looks like everything was approved. Great.
All right, and so now we invite members to vote to approve the 2022 to 2023 budget as presented.
That was just done. That was the last.
Sorry.
No worries. Yeah. All the polling done at once, just a little easier. So I think your job is done now, Scott. Thank you. All right, so next is just back to me. It's my pleasure to do some recognitions and thank the many individuals and agencies that make the ISCMB what it is. So first of all, my thanks to the 2021-22 board of directors, an amazing group of people who are the reason why I love doing this work. Brian Campbell, Fiona Steele, Gwen Taylor, Elen Marcoux, Julia Allard-Tomlin, Carrie Pocock, Ken Crosby, Lori Bates-Frimal, Lisa Dreves, Melinda Young, Paul Chapwinek, Peggy DeMarco, and Scott Walmsley. So we haven't met in person in a while. This is one of our last meetings where we take group photos on Zoom. But please, yeah, give yourselves a pat on the back, and the rest of you on the call, please give a virtual thank you to these folks for steering the organization. And now the part where I get really emotional, where I talk about our outgoing board members. So we have 3 directors whose terms have ended, and they're going on to do other things. So first of all, Fiona, who's been a board member since 2011, almost since the beginning. And we've worked together for many, many years. And I'm thankful that it's not a goodbye to Fiona. Although her time on the board is complete, she and I work together on a lot of other projects and consult with each other on lots of different things. And she's contributed not only to my personal development, but has also been such an ally for the ISCMB for so many years. And I will miss you very much, Fiona, but we'll do lunch in the fall and I'll give you a hug then.
Thanks, Tasha.
Peggy DeMarco is owner operator for Actual Landscaping in Maple Ridge, and she's been a board member since 2017. And we at the board and staff have loved hearing about her travel adventures and about her farm life, living and operating a landscaping business in a rural neighborhood, and we will miss her stories. And finally, Carrie is a longtime partner and supporter of the ISCMB, but she's been a board member since 2019. This photo right here was taken in May 2017 at a joint event that we held to celebrate Invasive Species Action Month in Stanley Park. So at the time she was working for the Stanley Park Ecology Society, and she's dressed in invasive garb because we had a photo booth that folks could participate in. She's had a few jobs since her SPES job during that time, and has always maintained her support and dedication to working on invasives and also advocating for community stewardship. And I'm really honored to have worked with Carrie on the board, and she will also be very missed. So thanks to all three of you for everything that you've contributed to our board. And next, thanks to our staff who were with us for the last fiscal year. So Isabel, a former full-time ISCMV staffer, has helped in the last year with training and some special projects. My main partner right now is Larissa. She's the only other full-time staff person currently, and she's our operations coordinator, and she's back for really a third year. And she is amazing. Thank you, Larissa, for everything that you do for us. This is me. And then last year, we also had a part-time summer student named Kathleen Cathcart, who was largely helping Larissa with our operations program. I'd also like to thank the Vancouver Park Board's Fieldhouse Activation Program. So that program transforms former caretaker suites in parks or underused facilities across Vancouver and gives them over for community partners like us. And so we're grateful to occupy the Adanac Park Fieldhouse Suite as our headquarters. That's where I am today. And that's been a wonderful partnership for us to get free space with some in-kind give back. And we also have a number of different community partners that store equipment or otherwise use this space as well. So I think that's it for me for recognitions, and I'll pass it back to you, Melinda, for the next item on our agenda.
Great. Thank you, Tasha. And I'll also take a moment to thank everybody that's been on the board and our exiting board members. I'll miss you guys as well, but I know I'll be continuing to work with some people. And obviously, thanks to all the staff, everybody at the ISCMB is so great. So I will also now pass this to another board member, Lisa Dreves, who is going to go over the nominees for the new board.
Thank you, Melinda. It's great on Zoom. You don't have to wait for people to walk up to the front of the room. It's great. Anyway, we have 7 positions which are currently open, and we only received 6 nominations. So we have the following nominees, which will be elected by acclamation for the next term, which is 2022 to 2025. And they are Amy Hendel, Graham Watson, Ken Crosby, Matthew Savenki, Melinda Young, and Richard Top. And Ken and Melinda have been with us for a while, as you probably tell. I quite enjoy working with them and glad they're still here, especially since Melinda's been our chair for so long. Amy and Graham are actually past employees, and we're happy to have them back in this new capacity. And Matthew and Richard are new to our group and looking forward to working with them. The various positions that people will hold will be determined at the next board meeting. That's it from me.
Welcome to all of our new directors. You will hear from me shortly, and we'll be getting to work and setting the date for our next board meeting. I think that's it, Melinda. I think, yeah, officially our AGM can come to a close. What do you think?
Yes, I think we can finish this and move on to our next speaker. That's great.
Excellent. Thank you for sticking with us for our AGM. So I'm really pleased to introduce our next speaker. Emma Nicol is from the Fraser Valley and has a background in integrated pest management and agriculture work. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Studies from Trinity Western University and Masters of Science from University of BC. Her interests are in plants and conservation work, especially in light of climate change. And it's been my pleasure to get to know Emma over the last 2 years, I think we said, 18 months maybe, and also to support her research that she is about to present to all of us. So welcome, Emma.
Thank you, Tasha. I will work on sharing my screen. Those takes a second longer than you think. Should be used to it by now. There we go. Everyone can see.
Yep, all looks good.
All right, give me one second. My screen decided to freeze, so.
Yeah, it took a little second for it to show up on ours as well, but we can see it now.
All right, perfect. I think we are good. All right, yes, yes, thank you, Tasha, for the introduction. Like she said, today I will be sharing my master's research looking into the effects of climate change on the habitat suitability of 4 relatively new invasive plant species in the Pacific Northwest. So especially in the past few years, it's been hard to miss the effects of climate change in the Pacific Northwest. We've experienced extreme heat waves, wildfires, flooding, and these events are predicted to become more common as climate change is forecasted to cause drier summers and wetter winters. But how will this affect the ability of invasive plant species to spread? Well, Metro Vancouver in particular was interested to know how species on the early detection or prevention lists may spread due to climate change. And with the hope of providing this information to more regional land managers, I've broadened the range to include the Pacific Northwest as a whole. But how can we predict the potential changes in habitat suitability? Well, while there's many variations of modeling methods, one way to predict potential changes is to use habitat suitability modeling. It also is referred to as species distribution modeling. This method develops correlative relationships between the recorded species occurrence points and key environmental variables such as climate, and projects those relationships to produce current suitability of an area and can be projected into the future under different climate change scenarios. So one limitation of this modeling method is the consideration of abiotic variables such as climate only, without the inclusion of biotic factors such as species interactions or dispersal ability, which unfortunately are often hard to account for due to data constraints. So this potentially results in the models over-predicting suitable habitat. However, that is more valuable than under-predictions when considering invasive species in particular. And regardless, these models provide the necessary first step in understanding interactions between invasive species and climate change. So the majority of habitat suitability or species distribution modeling studies have been on a global or continental scale, which is useful for general trends in the movement of species, but does not provide the information local land managers need to assess species in their regions. So very few studies have looked at invasive species in the Pacific Northwest, and even fewer have focused on invasive plants, especially with a focus on prevention. So to address this gap in knowledge, I developed a couple research questions for this project. So since invasive plants are often found in habitats with a particular land cover or land use, and are most often spread through human-mediated ways, I was interested in the relative contributions of climate, land cover, and human influence on the modeled current habitat suitability of these newly arriving invasive plant species. And secondly, how do future climate projections potentially change the suitable habitat available to each species? So will the suitability expand or contract due to climate change? So just a quick overview of the species in question. So like I said previously, all these species are listed on the provincial early detection and rapid response list here in BC, which essentially means that they have been identified as species of concern, and risk assessments are being conducted in order to prevent or contain them before they can become established. So these species are currently found at very few sites in BC, which are in the process of being contained or eradicated. So I looked at shiny geranium and mouse ear hawkweed as 2 terrestrial species. Both these species outcompete local native species by forming dense mats, which sets them apart from other geranium and hawkweed species already naturalized to the area. Shiny geranium spreads by seed and can produce up to 5 generations in one growing season and creates a very persistent seed bank lasting for years in the soil. So it can be very difficult to get rid of once it's established. And on the other hand, mouse ear hawkweed more often spreads by growing runners that take root and produce daughter plants, but likewise, it is very difficult and costly to control if allowed to establish. And I also looked at 2 aquatic species, flowering rush and water hyacinth. So flowering rush is a reed-like species that clogs waterways and is rapidly replacing native species. It actually has 2 forms. So an emergent form in shallower waters that produces these pink flowers, and a completely submerged form that spreads vegetatively in deeper waters. Water hyacinth, on the other hand, is a common ornamental pond plant that is unfortunately still sold in many nurseries, but it is considered one of the worst invasive plants globally. It is native to tropical and subtropical regions of Brazil, growing in slow-moving freshwater, spreading both vegetatively and by seed. And actually, in warm, nutrient-rich waters, it can double its biomass within 2 weeks, quickly forming a mat on the surface of the water. So both these species significantly decrease water quality while quickly dominating an area. And the first steps of habitat suitability modeling is collecting the species records and environmental variables. So these records were gathered from open access sources submitted by citizen scientists through iNaturalist, for example, universities and government groups. These records underwent an extensive cleaning process, and the main reason for the huge losses that you can see here, especially for flowering rush and water hyacinth, were that the records were in quite close proximity to each other. So they were eliminated to account for spatial bias. So only 1 record per kilometer square was retained, as is consistent with the resolution of the environmental variables, of which I initially chose to consider 33 bioclimatic variables, which are biologically relevant climate variables using measures of temperature and precipitation, 10 land cover types, and a human influence index consisting of human population density, built up areas, and roadways, for example. So in order to answer my first research question regarding the contributions of climate, land cover, and human influence, I first assessed the correlations between variables, removing highly correlated variables using Pearson's correlation coefficient and the variance inflation factor. So this brought the list of predictor variables for each species down to between 7 and 12 variables each. Then to begin building the ensemble model, I used 6 algorithms, including 3 regression methods and 3 machine learning methods. So taking a consensus of multiple algorithms often decreases the potential uncertainty associated with considering only one. And as these models require presence and absence data, but the species data available is often only comprised of species presences, I generated pseudo-absence data points equal to the number of species presence points. So the species data was split 70-30 into model training and testing data sets, which were run 5 times per species. And all of this resulted in 300 models per species, which were evaluated using the true skill statistic, through which models with a score of 0.7 or higher were used in the final ensemble model. So with this ensemble model, I could evaluate how the environmental variables contributed to the model, producing these response curves that show the probability of a species being present under differing levels of each variable. So this would show, for example, if a species has a higher probability of being found at higher temperatures rather than lower temperatures, for example. I could also determine how much each variable influenced the model. So then, to answer my next research question, the current habitat suitability model was projected into 3 future climate scenarios, as seen here in this graph from the most recent IPCC assessment report. So essentially a moderate middle of the road scenario, 4.5, and 2 scenarios of increasing CO2 levels, 7 and 8.5. These scenarios were projected to 2050 and 2080, and each is comprised of the top 3 general circulation models for Western North America. So this created 6 habitat suitability maps for each species. So 2050 and 2080 for each of the 3 climate scenarios. So now looking at the results for each species, shiny geranium is already widely spread in Oregon with fewer occurrences in Washington and BC. So while its current habitat suitability is quite high and contained relatively close to the coast, staying west of the Cascade Mountain Range, as we see in both the better and worst case scenarios, suitability increases in higher latitudes and higher elevations, and some suitability is lost in Southern Oregon, particularly by 2080 in the highest CO2 scenario. These results suggest that shiny geranium will continue to be a species of concern for Metro Vancouver and the Pacific Northwest, and ongoing management strategies should be continued. So here is another way to visualize the increases and decreases in suitable habitat by 2050 and 2080. In the better and worst case scenarios. So this gives a bit more insight into the regions that will experience the highest decreases, namely Oregon, and the highest increases seen in Washington and Vancouver Island, particularly at the higher elevations. So you can see in the darker red. And while some suitability is predicted to be lost in Oregon, this may not be enough to remove well-established current populations, especially by 2050, but it is interesting to note that the region may not remain highly suitable in the future. And assessing the contributing variables showed that a greater number of degree days below 0 Celsius and too much summer precipitation resulted in a decreased probability of suitable habitat for the species. And next we have mouse ear hawkweed, which compared to shiny geranium is more prevalent on the East Coast and has far fewer records in the Pacific Northwest currently. Overall, it has higher potential suitability now than in any future scenarios. By 2050, mouse ear hawkweed is predicted to lose suitable habitat in lower elevations and maintain moderate to high suitability in some higher latitudes and in higher elevations, like along the Cascade Mountain Range, for example. And the decrease in suitability is seen more strongly under the higher CO2 scenarios. So here you can see the regions of highest decrease and the potential movement of mouse ear hawkweed to these higher elevations in red. Due to its limited current distribution in the Pacific Northwest and the potential for greater decreases in suitability than increases in the future, these results suggest that mouse ear hawkweed may be a lower priority species for management in Metro Vancouver and in the Pacific Northwest, although continued monitoring and removal of current populations is definitely appropriate to limit spread to higher elevations. And compared to shiny geranium, suitable habitat for mouse ear hawkweed needs a greater number of degree days below 0 Celsius and a low annual heat moisture index. So while the 2 terrestrial species have fairly strong suitability results, the aquatic species results were a bit different. Here we have flowering rush, which, like mouse ear hawkweed, only has a few occurrences in the Pacific Northwest so far, but has become a huge issue in Eastern Canada and the northeastern states for quite some time now. Coastal regions of the Pacific Northwest are currently low to moderately suitable and are predicted to retain this level of suitability compared to the increased suitability of habitats further inland. And here you can see the increases in future potential habitat suitability are mostly seen in higher latitudes and inland locations. The overall increases and decreases are quite minimal compared to the terrestrial species. And these very light colors are not significant enough to alter if flowering rush can become established or not. So overall, the Pacific Northwest will remain moderately suitable for flowering rush, and continued efforts to contain populations should be maintained. Although it's interesting to note that their establishment near coastal areas may be somewhat limited. And increased summer precipitation decreases the potential of suitable habitat, while increased humidity and extreme maximum temperatures increases the potential of suitable habitat for flowering rush. And lastly, we have water hyacinth, and being a tropical plant, it is currently far more common in Mexico or the southern states, but has been found in a few locations in the Pacific Northwest. Water hyacinth maintains moderate to high suitability in the sheltered and inland freshwater areas around Metro Vancouver and Seattle in particular. These areas should be the highest priority for monitoring this species. It does need to be noted that while water hyacinth can currently grow in the Pacific Northwest, it may not be able to overwinter, and further studies are needed to differentiate between its ability to grow seasonally or establish year-round. So for example, it was found to overwinter in a Metro Vancouver location in 2020, but it did not persist at that location in 2021. And as with flowering rush, the suitability increases are very minimal and do not suggest water hyacinth will be able to establish in all areas of the Pacific Northwest. But despite the question of whether populations of water hyacinth can become established, the trend is definitely toward increasing suitability. And this species hugely negative impacts in many other regions of the world suggest that continued monitoring and prevention of this species is definitely needed. And the variable response suggests that water hyacinth needs a minimum of 350 frost-free days for a habitat to be suitable. And likewise, the potential suitability decreases with any snowfall or when humidity is less than 65%. So however, when these habitat conditions are met, there's currently only about a 50% probability that water hyacinth could establish compared to 80 to 90% for the other species. But this is consistent with water hyacinth's current varying ability to overwinter in this region. So in summary, overall climate variables were the most important predictive factors for each species, most notably the number of degree days below zero and summer and winter precipitation. Shiny geranium and flowering rush are generally shifting northwards. Mousy or hawkweed may potentially lose suitability, and water hyacinth suitability is generally increasing in the Pacific Northwest. So my results suggest that climate change is not impacting the movement of invasive species equally, and concerning species need to be assessed individually. These models can be a useful tool to predict the potential future habitat suitability of invasive species when good quality data is available. And habitat suitability maps provide insight into the potential shifting of invasive species due to climate change and other human influences, which is a critical component to consider in invasive species management. The impact of climate change is often not included in species risk assessments. So these models provide a way for land managers to incorporate the effects of climate change in their species risk assessments to develop more targeted strategies and prioritize their efforts. As you all know, informed preventative measures are the most effective way to manage invasive species and far less costly than control measures once the species has become established. And my research provides a working template for the necessary modeling of additional species of concern in the Pacific Northwest. And just moving forward, while I have completed my master's program, I am continuing to share these results both locally and through publishing in an academic journal. I'm also continuing to model some other species with limited or no current records in the Pacific Northwest, such as kudzu, water lettuce, or Brazilian elodia, for example. And I'm also exploring how this modeling may be used for invasive species already established in Metro Vancouver and how we could incorporate more local data. It's a little bit more detailed. And lastly, I just want to acknowledge the many people that were involved in this project who helped me make it happen. Input from Lori Bates-Brimel from with Metro Vancouver, as well as funding from Metro Van and NSERC. My advisors, Jen Williams and David Clements from UBC and Trinity Western, and a huge amount of support from Tasha here with the Invasive Species Council, Metro Van, and Shonali Chai with the Ministry of Agriculture. It was very wonderful to work with a very supportive team. And that is all I have. So thank you. And I will take any questions you have now.
Thank you, Emma. I don't see any questions in the chat, but feel free to pop those in there, or if folks have questions, also feel welcome to unmute yourself and ask directly. I do have a question for you, Emma. I think the work that you did is really suited to a certain type of person. I know it's a lot of tedious hours with you and Delia at the computer. What, if you were to summarize, what kind of student or person would be best suited for this habitat modeling work? What would you say?
That's a good question. Probably, it's very interesting to figure out, but probably someone with a little bit more computer science background might get a little further quicker. It's taken me a while to grasp some of the modeling, and it would be great to spend more years on it, because I think it's just getting better, and the longer you spend on it, obviously the more you will be able to do yourself. So yeah, I think any kind of coding experience is also like super beneficial, which is also something I learned for the first time doing this project. So yeah, definitely in that realm, but an interest in the plants is definitely helpful. So I'm not going to discount that too much.
All right, I think, thanks again. I don't see any questions. I see Lori has her hand up. Go ahead, Lori.
Right, thanks, Emma. This was a lot more detailed than the presentation you made for our elected officials at the Metro Vancouver board. So I wanted to just acknowledge the fact that Emma did a great job presenting in front of the Climate Action Committee at Metro Vancouver and answering some questions from the elected officials who were pretty keen on this research. I do have a question for you, Emma. Have you shared this with Becky Brown from the province, all your results?
I have not thus far. I have been in contact with her in the past. Definitely in the past couple of years, there's been a handful of times that I've been in contact with her. But I will. That's still my plan to do. I haven't heard back recently from her, so I will contact her again and hopefully learn a little bit more about what they're doing as well with some modeling that I've heard of. So.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that was one of the things that she'd noted, I think, early in this project was that they had done some habitat suitability modeling at the provincial level. So I'm curious to know how your results compare to some of the work that they've done.
Yes, I'm definitely curious about that as well. So something I definitely will pursue.
Thanks again, Emma.
A question from Sarah. Go ahead, Sarah, if you'd like.
Hi, Emma. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, great presentation. I definitely appreciate the tedious work it takes to do GLMs and GLMMs. I did a similar study for my master's way back when, but on mobile terrestrial beings. I did mine on black bears and looking at GPS modeling. Was there any particular barriers to data collection that was difficult for you, or were you able to find a lot of the data just through like lit reviews and access to provincial databases, or was there extra steps you had to go through to get more clear pictures of the distribution maps with these invasive species?
Yeah, so the data is fairly available. So luckily I could use, I could find quite a quite a number of records. Unfortunately, because the project is focused on plants that are not fully established in this region, at least, and often are not fully established in a lot of their invasive range, there is just inherently less records available for them. So that was probably the biggest trick with some of these species, and some that I will be looking at moving forward may not have enough records available to model them at this time. So that's yeah, kind of probably the trickiest part about it. But yeah, otherwise there are quite a number of records available, and it's super helpful to have platforms like iNaturalist, and luckily I made kind of a cleaning protocol that not all of them necessarily made the cut, but and that's also an unfortunate kind of side effect of some of the community science. If they're not super detailed, they're not actually terribly effective, but overall, it was great to have all those records available. So yeah, not too many issues there.
A question from Grace.
Hi, Emma. I think you had a brief point at the end where you said it would be interesting to investigate the invasive plants that are currently spread around the Lower Mainland area. Is that something that's actually going to be investigated, that you're investigating, or it's something that would be interesting to look at in the future?
Yeah, I am hoping to have at least one species as kind of an example model for what could be done for species that are more established. Obviously, the current suitability is not like super interesting because they're already here. We know that it's currently suitable, but definitely looking at the future scenarios and the other, with those species comes more details. So I am hoping to have kind of a local and regional model to combine and potentially have extra details in there, like distance to waterways or things like that that are a little bit more specific. So yes, I am hoping I should have enough time to at least model one species as kind of an example of what can be done, and then hopefully that can be continued at a later date, maybe by somebody else. So yeah.
That's great.
All right, thanks again, Emma, for presenting your work, and look forward to hearing from you about other stuff to come this fall.
Yes, thank you very much for having me.
So in closing, I just had a few upcoming events that I wanted to share with you. All of these are virtual. So coming up tomorrow, the ISCBC is hosting a workshop on holistic weed management by Dr. Catherine Tarasoff, who's a really great presenter. So if you're free tomorrow afternoon, you can sign up for that. October 19th, ISCBC hosting another webinar on Canadian pesticide registration. November 15th, I will be hosting an online session focused on Indigenous perspectives and stewardship. So this program is designed with a stewardship focus, and we have somebody coming to speak on that. Larissa's going to pop some links into the chat, but you can register for all of these things right now on either the ISCBC website, our website, or the Invasive Species Center, which is a Canadian and national agency. Their virtual Invasive Species Forum is happening February 7th to 9th next year. And so that's kind of designed for Canadian practitioners and also partners in the US. Also, for those of you who may have attended ISCBC invasives forums in the past, they've been online the last few years. So this is from the ISCBC. They have date set for their 2023 forum, and it will be in person, February 28th to March 2nd. Those of you that have been to this event in the past, you might be familiar with the Gateway Hotel in Richmond, where it's been held for years and years and years, but the hotel is undergoing extensive renovations. So they have a new venue in New West where this event will be. So you can save the date. This event is not up on their website yet, but in the coming months, registration will open and they'll have more details about their agenda. And typically they have great speakers relevant to people working at the regional level, but also the provincial level. If you have any other upcoming events that you'd like to share with the group, feel free to pop those into the chat. In closing, thanks to all of our presenters for sharing their work. Thanks to Larissa for co-hosting and for all of our directors who managed our AGM. And thank you so much to all of you for taking the time to join us today. I hope we see you at our next event. So this adjourns our fall forum, but I will stick around if anybody wants to say hello or have a little bit of a chat. I will be here. But this concludes our event. So thank you very much and goodbye.